Hey, what's going on, everybody? It's Walter here with Thimin. The last two videos we explored what it means to drift from ourselves and living from borrowed conviction. If you're familiar with the movie The Lion King, we see how these two themes play out. In the film, it gives us a mirror of how drift begins, often starting in childhood. Simba, he was raised in a very deeply supportive environment designed to help him grow into a king. And his father Mufasa teaches through context. He gives Simba proportion, not punishment. He shows him how the world works so Simba can make good decisions and not just follow orders. We see this in the moment after the hyena encounter where Mufasa saves Simba and Nala from them. And on their way back, Mufasa was very disappointed and tells Zazu that to take Nala home as he needs to teach his son a lesson. But the lesson isn't about obedience, it's about responsibility, fear, and love. And as Simba walks towards Mufasa, he steps in his father's big paw print and he's swallowed by the size of it. It's a quiet image, but it says everything that Simba has so much growing to do mentally, emotionally, and physically before he can fill that role. He's literally standing inside the future he's not ready for. Simba feels bad for disobeying his father, but Mufasa doesn't lecture him. He doesn't shame him. He has a serious, open conversation about not looking for danger and only being brave when it's necessary. He tells Simba the truth that you could have been killed, and he admits that he was scared. So he's relating to Simba instead of towering over him. At first, Simba has to look up to Mufasa. The physical height difference mirroring the emotional gap between them. But once Simba understands the lesson, Mufasa lowers his head to Simba's eye level. And this shift is subtle but profound. He moves from authority to connection, from teaching to comforting. He projects calm, safety, and understanding. And this is the last moment before everything breaks. The last moment before Simba feels held, guided, and proportioned. It's the last moment responsibility feels like something he can grow into rather than something that will crush him. Simba starts to seem physically and emotionally small. He's ashamed, scared, and trying to hide his bravado. He's literally looking up at Mufasa, and the height difference mirrors their internal gap between them. Mufasa, he begins full in stature, and it's not to intimidate, but to hold seriousness of the moment. He's anchored, he's not punishing, he's calibrating. He says, I need to teach my son a lesson, but the lesson isn't about obedience, it's about proportion and responsibility. When Mufasa tells the truth about his own fear, that he was scared today, it dissolves the shame without dissolving accountability. It shows Simba that strength and vulnerability aren't opposites, they're integrated. The moment Mufasa lowers himself, once Simba absorbs the lesson, once the emotional gaps closes, Mufasa Mufasa physically lowers his head to Simba's level. And what this does is it communicates to Simba that he's safe, he's still loved, that Mufasa, his father, is still with him, not above you. The lesson is complete, and now we can reconnect. And it's just such a great sequence, the height to hold seriousness, the honesty to create connection, and the lowering the head to restore safety. Mufasa models strength, truth, connection, and restoration. And it's in this moment, this quiet, exchange between father and son that you see the world that Simba's growing inside. It's a world where responsibility is introduced gently. A world where mistakes are met with context and not punishment. A world where the future feels far away because someone bigger is holding it up. And this is the last time Simba feels that kind of safety because the rupture doesn't arrive as a lesson, it arrives as a collapse. One moment Simba's a child trying to understand the size of the paw he's meant to grow into, and then the next, he's mourning the death of his father that becomes the dividing line. Mufasa's death isn't just the loss of a father, but it's the loss of orientation, the loss of proportion, the loss of the person who could translate responsibility into something Simba could grow toward instead of something that crushes him. And in that chaos, Scar gives Simba a story that he's too young to question, that he caused the collapse, that he's responsible for Mufasa's death, that the only option is to run. This is the moment drift begins. Not as rebellion, not as avoidance, but as a child carrying a weight that he was never meant to hold. The exile doesn't start with a choice, it starts with a wound. Before the drift, he had the father who taught through presence and proportion. And after the drift, he loses that mirror, and that's why he collapses into borrowed conviction. Drift is a response to pain, not a character flaw. Simba runs not because he's weak, but because he's overwhelmed. Scar guilted him into thinking he's responsible for Mufasa's death. Drift always starts with something we don't know how to process. For Simba, exile becomes the only option that makes emotional sense. He runs until the world stops reminding him of who he used to be. He runs until the environment no longer demands anything of him. He runs until the weight of responsibility, something he was never ready for, finally falls away. And this part, can be misunderstood, where the drift is seen as failure, seeing the Hakuna Matata years as avoidance, seeing the distance as immaturity. But the truth is quieter than that, and it's far more human. These are the years where Simba stabilizes, the years where nothing is asked of him because he has nothing left to give. The years where the self stops collapsing long enough to survive the wound. Timon and Pumbaa, they don't rescue him, but they hold him. They create a world simple enough for him to breathe in, a world where the past can't reach him, a world where responsibility is replaced with distraction. And distraction is enough to keep him alive. This is the liminal space, the misunderstood chapter between collapse and return. It's not growth, it's not healing, it's not avoidance, it's the pause. It's the necessary pause, the place where the self gathers just enough strength to one day face what it ran from. And Hakuna Matata is the borrowed conviction. That's what Simba adopts, Timon and Pumbaa's worldview because it's easier than facing himself. It feels good, but it's not his worldview. It's a coping mechanism disguised as philosophy. And this shows up in real life, things like careers chosen for safety, relationships chosen for comfort, identities chosen to avoid conflict, habits chosen to numb discomfort. Hakuna Matata is the universal coping mechanism. And over time, Simba shrinks his responsibility, his identity, his lineage, his potential. And when we shrink ourselves, others pay the price, just like the Pride Land suffered while Simba hid. And at some point in the drift, the real self tries to speak. And when the world can't hold that truth, the drift deepens. Not because the self disappears, but because it gets pushed back into hiding. When Timon, uh, Pumbaa, and Simba are all looking up at the stars and they're given their take on what they think it means, Timon asks Simba what he thought, and Simba didn't want to at first. And then he reluctantly says that he was once told that the stars represent the great kings of the past watching over us. And it was, a very quiet, serious, profound moment. And then Timon and Pumbaa laugh hysterically. And that's when you see a deeply wounded being shrinking himself, lost self belief, longing for something greater, and he's in despair. So Simba laughs to hide his hurt. It's one of the most quietly devastating moments in the movie. Simba is doing more than just answering a question in that moment. He's testing whether to see if it's safe to speak from his origin again. It's the first time he touches that memory since the stampede. It's fragile, hesitant, almost whispered. So this reinforces the lie that he believes being responsible for the death of his father and is unworthy of that lineage, while also performing the persona of carefree, detached, Hakuna Matata, right? That's why he laughs it off. Oh, it's no big deal. See, even Simba said, as Timon and Pumbaa are laughing, he's like, yeah, pretty dumb, right? Actually, it's pretty sad. So when Timon and Pumbaa laugh, they're not mocking him. They simply just don't understand the weight of what he's saying. But to Simba, it lands as confirmation. My truth is ridiculous. My pain is invisible. My lineage is unbelievable. I don't belong anywhere. I should never bring this part of myself up again. He's grieving the part of himself that he abandoned. He's longing for his father, for meaning, for belonging, and he feels isolated because no one around him understands the weight that he carries. He's in despair because he thinks the truth of who he is gone forever. He's not thinking they're wrong. He's thinking maybe I am really nothing now. This is remembering who he was before he ran, and that memory got laughed back into hiding. So he shrinks because he's already living in exile from himself. The laughter just pushes him deeper into that exile. These are the exact moments where the self reaches out and gets pushed back under. Simba never stopped being himself. He just stopped believing he was allowed to be. A lot of us have a version of this moment. It happens when, we share something sacred and it's dismissed. We reveal a wound and someone jokes about it. We express a longing and it's misunderstood. We try to reconnect with who we were before we drift. We test whether it's safe to be ourselves again. We speak from our origin and it gets laughed at. Most people don't call it what it is. They just feel the collapse and bury that part of themselves for years. Simba's moment is the cinematic version of a very deeply human event. But this sets up for the confrontation with Nala. Nala is the relational mirror. And during their confrontation, this is when Simba's exile is exposed. Nala urges him to return because the Pride Lands are dying, but Simba can't tell her the real reason why he left and why he refuses to go back. He's protecting a shame. And when Nala tells him that the hyenas have taken over and everything is collapsing, that's when you start to see the first crack. Simba realizes that abandoning himself didn't just hurt him, it hurt everyone who depended on him. But even that is not enough to pull him out of hiding. Then she says the line that cuts through his entire persona. What happened to you? You're not the Simba I remember. And this is when Simba's mask slips. He fires back. You're right. Are you satisfied? And it's very defensive, brittle, and hollow. It's an answer meant to end the conversation, not to reveal anything. And Nala doesn't back down. She says a resolute no, just disappointed. And that word disappointment, it hits him harder than the accusation. It's the first time someone has spoken to that part of him he's been running from. And Simba, he snaps back with, "You sound just like my father." And that's when Nala snaps back with, "Good, at least one of us does." And when she says that, it hits a layer that nothing else has touched. Nala's line doesn't accuse him, it remembers him. And being remembered is more threatening to Simba than being blamed, because blame attacks the wound, but remembrance attacks the story he's been using to survive. Simba's entire exile rests on one fragile belief: if I never go back, I never have to face what I've done. And Nala's presence destabilizes that belief. She knows the version of him that he abandoned. She sees the king inside. She speaks to the part of him that he's been hiding from. And this is why he lashes out, because she's right. This confrontation exposes the truth he's been running from. He stayed away because he was ashamed. He avoided the pain of believing he caused a collapse. And Nala's disappointment, it isn't judgment, it's recognition. And recognition is the one thing that Simba can't defend against himself. This scene doesn't make Simba return, but it makes him remember that returning is even possible. It awakens the buried longing, the dormant identity, the ache of who he used to be, the truth he's been avoiding, the part of him that still wants to matter. It's the first time the exile is pierced from the outside. The confrontation is the hinge. It's the moment the story turns from drift to return. And Nala doesn't flatter him. She doesn't rescue him. She doesn't shame him. She merely reflects him. You're not the Simba I remember. A Nala is someone who sees your real size and refuses to collude with your drift. She reflects the truth he's been avoiding. You're not who you're pretending to be. And then, Rafiki shows up and he becomes the internal mirror. He gives something more than advice. He awakens memory, telling Simba that you don't even know who you are. And Simba says, I suppose you do. And that's when Rafiki tells him, you're Mufasa's boy. And this is the moment that Drift collapses. This is the return to origin. This is the moment of realization. I'm not becoming someone new. I'm remembering someone old. Rafiki doesn't arrive to comfort Simba or to reason with him. He arrives to disrupt the story Simba has been living inside. Every line he speaks is designed to break the cycle that Simba has been trapped in. See, Simba's exile is held together by one belief: I can't go back because of what I did. And Rafiki's presence destabilizes that belief by introducing a new one. You're still connected to who you were before the wound. He doesn't argue, he doesn't explain, he provokes. And Rafiki functions to mirror Simba's avoidance by literally running away from him, forcing Simba to chase the truth he's been avoiding. That's why he ran away when he says, you're Mufasa's boy. Rafiki reframes the past by hitting Simba with his stick and saying it doesn't matter, it's in the past. And that's not to dismiss the wound, but it's to break its authority. And Rafiki also reactivates the inner Mufasa by guiding Simba to water, where the reflection becomes a doorway to memory. So Rafiki is the bridge between shame and identity. And when Rafiki hits Simba with the stick, that's the emotional pivot. That's when Simba says, "Ow, that hurt." And Rafiki replies, "Yes, the past can hurt." But then he shows Simba the choice he's never considered. You can either run from it or you can learn from it. And this is the first time Simba sees the past as something he can face rather than something he must flee. The wound stops being a cage and now it starts to become a teacher. This is what allows the awakening when Mufasa returns. Uh, when Simba's chasing Rafiki, and then Rafiki finally agrees to uh, show him his father's still alive. That's when Rafiki leads Simba through the darkness of the jungle, and you see him going through all the darkness of the trees, the shaded area, and all that represents what he was running from. And then eventually takes him to the water, and in that moment, Rafiki uh, implies that Mufasa's there, and Simba only sees himself. And Simba says, "That's not my father. That's just my reflection." And Rafiki says, "Look harder." And this is the emotional equivalent of someone saying, "You're looking at the wound. Look at the lineage beneath it." So when Mufasa appears in the sky, that's the reactivation of Simba's internal orientation. The part of him that never died, it only went silent. Mufasa tells him the truth that no one else can say. You have forgotten who you are, and so you've forgotten me. This is the moment Simba realizes the exile wasn't distance from the Pride Lands, it was distance from himself. This is the drift, or this is the shift that makes the return possible. Simba's return doesn't begin with courage, it begins with recognition. He remembers his lineage, his responsibility, his identity, his place in the world, the part of him that never collapsed. Rafiki doesn't heal Simba, he awakens him. He doesn't fix the wound, he restores a connection that makes healing possible. He doesn't push Simba home, he simply reminds him he has a home to return to. And this is the moment the story stops being about survival and it becomes about authorship. Rafiki's intervention works because it does something no one else in the story can do. It interrupts Simba's exile from inside his psyche, not from outside it. Nala confronts him, the stars whisper to him, but Rafiki reaches to the part of Simba that still remembers who he is and pulls it forward. So the return is not about becoming someone new. It's about alignment. It's about remembering someone old, and he returns to the king he already was. It's interesting because you don't need to become more. You just need to stop being less. Stop avoiding or stop shrinking yourself. And and that's what Simba did in that moment. He stopped shrinking himself. And the return started the moment when Mufasa says, "Remember who you are." Simba doesn't suddenly become brave, but he becomes reconnected. He says, "Now I know what I have to do." So the exile breaks when the internal Mufasa comes back, not as a memory, but as orientation. And Simba turns toward home not because he feels ready, but because he finally remembers he belongs somewhere. And the return begins with recognition, not confidence. And you can see the return is not clean. Simba runs back through the desert with the shame still alive, fear still present, doubt still whispering, the wound still open. He doesn't return healed, but he returns aligned. The return is not the end of the wound, it's the beginning of responsibility. And when Simba reaches Pride Rock, he isn't confronting Scar first. He's confronting the version of himself that believed he caused a collapse. The lie he lived inside, the shame that shaped his exile, the fear that kept him small, the identity he abandoned. And you start to see that the return is relational, not individual. Simba doesn't return alone, he returns with Nala's belief, Rafiki's awakening, Mufasa's orientation, and Timon and Pumbaa's unexpected loyalty. It's the self supported by the relationships that survive the drift. That's why the moment that Timon and Pumbaa show up matters. They represent the exile coming with him, not being erased. They gave Simba a safe space to just be. And that return is the collapse of the lie. When he finally confronts Scar or has a confrontation with Scar, Scar tries to weaponize Simba's shame again. He pushes the exact wound that drove Simba into exile. But this time, Simba doesn't run. He stands in the wound instead of fleeing from it. And when Scar says, you're responsible for Mufasa's death," Simba breaks the cycle by saying, "No, I'm not." And that is the real return. It's not the fight, it's not the roar, it's not the victory. The return is the moment the lie loses its power. The return doesn't begin when Simba runs across the desert. It begins the moment he remembers who he is. Mufasa's voice doesn't give him courage, it gave him orientation. It reconnects him to the part of himself that never died. It only went silent. Simba doesn't go back because he feels ready. He goes back because he finally remembers he belongs somewhere. And when he eventually climbs up Pride Rock, that's very symbolic because it's the ascent back into authorship. Every step is a step out of the story that Scar wrote for him, out of the story he's been living inside. All the shame, the exile, the lie. He carries all that with him that is part of the journey that made him whole. So you can see that the return isn't clean. It's a wounded self choosing responsibility over avoidance. He's not becoming someone new. He's becoming someone who he always was before the wound. The Pride lands bloom again because the internal ecosystem is restored. The king returns because the self returns. This is why the ending feels like breath after suffocation. It's proportion. We can see how drift and borrowed conviction affected Simba and how he was able to return to himself. It's really common for us to experience this in some capacity. And it's a good reminder that we all have our internal struggles, and that's nothing to be ashamed of. As long as we're aligned with who we are, we'll be fine. I'll see you next time.